Well, I am very honored to be here today representing Objective 3, my fellow graduate students, and especially Purdue University. 1 year ago to the day, I joined Purdue. So I feel like I've come a long way, and I'm really thrilled to be here. My advisor, Phillip Owens, and I have some research in digital soil mapping that I'm extremely excited about, and I am very glad to be sharing it with this incredibly distinguished group of scientists. So now that I sucked up, we can move on. So what is digital soil mapping? So there's been a paradigm shift in about the past 15 years in soil science and in soil mapping, moving away from these traditional USDA soil maps to predictive mapping, where we're using computers and algorithms as tools to give us better and more soil information. So digital soil mapping really involves taking any sort of digital information we could get related to soils, such as climate data, remotely sensed images, hydrological data, historic vegetation, current vegetation, taking that in combination with any field sample data we have, or not if we don't have it, to come up with some sort of predictions of what soils or what soil attributes or properties are below the vegetation. And really this is good for where we can't have intensive sampling. A lot of the times we just don't have the money to do it. I know we'd love to dig a hole everywhere, but we can't. So the fundamentals of digital soil mapping were based on Han Jenny's 5 soil forming factors that I think people probably have heard if you've taken an introductory soil course. So it's really the idea that soil at any given place is a function of climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time, and relief is topography. So this was later developed into a more digital method called ScorePan, which adds to the 5 soil forming factors, it also adds existing soil information, so what we already know, what a soil survey map says, and most importantly, N, which is our spatial position. So this is the idea that a soil that is in this spot is impacted by a soil that's next to it. And things are spatially related, and we can therefore use geostatistics to perhaps extrapolate data that we have. So why will we use digital soil mapping? So less expensive. Sometimes soil survey just isn't adequate. If we take a look at this the CA map unit over here, we can see that there's this big white light spot, but that mapping unit doesn't exactly line up with it. We can also see that we have these big polygons, and each of those polygons is one soil type with one set of properties. For example, soil carbon 0 to 4%. Now, I think we know that over a couple acres, we probably have more variability than that, than just giving one value to those soils. Also, U.S. Soil Survey was done based on the taxonomic differences, and instead we now want to map how things are similar. The mapping methods used for traditional soil survey relied heavily on these tacit mental models of soil scientists. And once we lose those soil scientists, we lose the methodology, the computer, that black box model that went into making them. Also, the soils are represented as these discrete, discontinuous polygons. Each polygon is going to have one value, even though we know soil is more variable than that. So that's not representative of the natural landscape. And oftentimes we need specific property values with more variation to feed our models, or also inform decisions such as where do we set up our field trials without really understanding soil variability. And also, digital soil mapping can provide a method for extrapolating our field scale data to a regional scale, which is another big goal of this project. Okay, so polygons. So our polygons are these discrete, discontinuous units. But a lot of the models that people are using and a lot of the data format that's popular right now is raster or continuous. So the idea is, how do we take this polygon that has one value and turn it into a raster or a grid that has many continuous values? And the way we actually do this is using what I call the Centroid Concept and topography. So kind of idea that my advisor Phillip Owens came up with is this idea of taxonomic heterogeneity versus functional homogeneity. So traditional soil survey delineated soils through pairs of aerial photographs, literally delineating, drawing lines on the landscape. So these soil units were grouped as series based on their physical morphological differences, so how they look different to the surveyor in the field. And they were not grouped based on their functionality. So if we take a look around this room and we start grouping each other based on how we look, I'd say we would probably first separate the women from the men, then we would separate people based on their skin color, maybe who wears glasses, who doesn't. And if we separated out and we looked at our groups, it would not be representative of our objectives. So I would say our objectives are functional groupings, as where if we just divided us up by how we look, we'd lose a lot of what type of scientists we actually are. So our goal is to then delineate and classify soils based on these functional similarities rather than these morphological differences. And this is done for us under the assumption that water movement and redistribution across the landscape is the driving factor in soil functional distribution, and that most importantly, topography is controlling water movement. And I'm sure that our farmers in the room today can say that where you are on the field and how wet it is going to have a lot of importance on your yield variability. So the goal of this project was to demonstrate, or this initial part, is to generate field-scale soil class and property maps related to soil function with the intent of identifying and upscaling soil processes to potentially predict greenhouse gas and yield responses. So what soils, what locations on the landscape are going to provide the best function for crops and also relate to greenhouse gas emissions? So there's three main approaches to digital soil mapping. There's purely geostatistics, which I'm not going to talk about today, and then there's a knowledge-based approach, where we use some of the knowledge that we already have as soil scientists. And then there's also a hybrid. So today I'm just going to talk about one knowledge-based approach that we're using, developed at Purdue, called the terrain attribute soil mapping. So basically how this works is we take a digital elevation model, which represents our topography, and then we derive some terrain attributes from them. So these are basically mathematical representations of some features of topography. So slope percent, aspect, those would be examples of terrain attributes. And these are all derived from algorithms from a digital elevation model. So once we derive these terrain attributes, we set rules to determine and define the relationships between those attributes and soil classes. So these relationships are then formalized through a series of if-then statements in a software. And you could do this kind of on your own as well. You don't need to use one of these softwares. So from this, then, these classes, a continuous soil class map is generated. So the important thing to remember is that these class maps are continuous because each pixel has associated probability of belonging to that class between 0 and 1. So one pixel can have membership in each class. So this is what allows us to create these continuous property maps, such as soil organic carbon, or for the example today, we made a map of depth to paleosol. Okay, so an example of one site that we're doing and one method is at the Southeastern Purdue Agricultural Center, the CPAC site. It's small, it's less than 10 acres. And this site is characterized by some thick loess over pre-Wisconsin aged till. So it has a very rolling topography with broad flat areas that have very thick loess over this red paleosol. Slope areas with less loess, and then depressions that have more accumulation of loess and colluvial material. So this landscape follows a very predictable model that can be defined through elevation and various attributes. Okay, so here's a digital elevation model. Okay, it's going from lowest is blue, highest is red. So we can see that in the corner there's a high spot. So from that, we can derive various terrain attributes. So one that's very important in terms of water movement is slope. Okay, so here we can see variability of slope. So we have flat areas at the bottom, flat areas at the top. Okay, So catchment area is showing where we're accumulating the most water, where is everything going. So that's going to be important to finding out classes. So this area in red has a high catchment area, and these are unitless values, by the way. So it has a very high catchment area, meaning we know a lot of water is going to accumulate, and that is going to give us a lot of information about how yield will respond. Okay, and then the most important one that we found is something called TWI, Topographic Wetness Index. And this is showing areas from where water is shedding and accumulating in red and shedding in blue. So areas where there's blue, we know they're probably going to be better drained and maybe potentially have less available water. So by literally taking the values of these, using histograms kind of to inspect them and see how they're distributed, we define a series of rules that are going to classify each pixel based on these terrain attributes. So from that, we came up with a class map. Okay, so here is our soil class map. And these are functional classes. So the green one is that bottomland, so that's going to be wet. The pink one is higher, it's going to be more dry. Okay, so here's a yield map from 2011. We can see that these blue areas, this is normalized yield, these have above average yield where it's blue, are corresponding to those lower areas in the field. So we are using yield data to validate these classes. All right, so here's the depth to paleosol map. So this is a continuous map. Each pixel is going to have a different value. And this was derived from that actual soil class map shown on the previous slide. And we're currently working to validate this. Okay, here's a 3D representation of that depth to paleosol. Okay, so conclusions are that we can use this knowledge-based approach to predict functional classes related to yield and productivity, and that these maps can be used to produce these continuous property estimates that can be used to feed models and form decisions. Okay, so future work, where we're going. The plan, and hopefully I would have a lot of people here who would like to invite me out to their sites because I would love to map additional sites. The more sites I map, the more opportunity there is for upscaling, comparing sites, coming up with connections, and how we can extrapolate this to larger areas. What we want to do is relate soil function to landscape position to develop quantitative models relating these functional areas to yield and productivity indices. Okay, so what does this all mean? What's the big picture? Where does DSM, digital soil mapping, fit into CSCAP? So once the soil factors which control a process are identified, the properties which control a specific function can be grouped to extrapolate the field trial results and provide scaled up region-wide estimates. Basically saying what we want to do is take some of the results of these field trials, try and identify the mathematical relationships between whatever metrics we're measuring and landscape position, soil functional type, and take that information and use it to scale up to region estimates. We want to provide continuous detailed soil property maps for model input. Oftentimes, there's more soil variability that might be needed for a model, or models might need soils information on, a certain resolution roster as opposed to these polygon maps that we all have now. And what I really think this is going and has a lot of importance is informing management decisions. Because if we understand what areas of the field are going to perform under what conditions, what areas of the field are going to benefit the most from additional fertilizer applications, variable planting rates, we're going to be able to make very informed decisions and kind of get the most out of our money in terms of planting and fertilization strategies. And that's it.